Welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles, where history's worst days become our latest obsession. I'm Katie Babbick.
And I'm Arin Babbick. And if you've ever stepped outside without checking the weather and immediately regretted it, well, this story is going to make you feel a lot better about your choices.
Today, we're talking about the children's blizzard, a winter storm so fast and so brutal that it caught thousands of people completely off guard, including hundreds of schoolchildren just trying to go home.
It started as a deceptively warm morning on January 12, 1888, so warm that the kids left their coats at home, teachers opened the windows, and settlers across the Great Plains let themselves believe, just for a moment, that winter was finally letting up.
But Mother Nature had other plans. By that afternoon, temperatures had plunged. Hurricane-force winds ripped across the prairie, and a blinding wall of snow swallowed everything in sight. Within minutes, what should have been an ordinary school day turned into a desperate fight for survival.
This is a story about impossible choices, staggering loss, and the brutal indifference of winter on the frontier. So bundle up. We're heading straight into the storm.
All right, folks, welcome back to Catastrophe Chronicles.
Welcome, welcome.
We are excited to be back, and we are, as the intro stated, doing the children's blizzard tonight.
Why is that, Katie?
Because we are in Virginia, and Winter Storm Kingston decided to fuck up our week. So we are stuck in our house because southwestern or southeastern Virginia doesn't do snow. And there's
they don't.
foot of snow outside.
Yep.
So we can't go anywhere. We're stuck.
Kids had a ball and playing in it.
Well, did they? They got real cold.
They did.
I spent most of the day thinking that I should tell them how much worse their day could be. And I decided that I really wanted to tell Arin about how bad it could be for kids in the snow in a blizzard.
You mentioned this to Malcolm this morning or yesterday morning.
I did.
And he freaked out a little bit.
I forget what I said exactly, but I said something about I'm going to tell Daddy about how kids die in the snow. And poor little kid.
Oh, in a blizzard.
Just
and we'd been telling him a blizzard was coming.
Poor guy. Poor kiddo. I adjusted. He's okay now. Everything's fine. But he had a moment. And I was like, this is why you don't listen to the podcast, child.
You can see the look on his face. Oh, man.
So, yeah, we're hitting up the blizzard tonight. I'm drinking a blizzard. I'm drinking a hot blizzard, which is coffee, Bailey's, Fireball whiskey. I think that's it. Half and half whipped cream.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's tasty, though. It's basically an Irish coffee, but it's apparently a hot blizzard. So,
Which is a complete oxymoron.
Well, I mean, I needed it to be warm. And with that, we're recording this early. We're going to be releasing this on the 28th, I think it is. Yeah, the 28th. And when this comes out and makes it to your ear holes, I just want all of you to know that while I'm recording this and saying that I'm cold, when it comes out, we're going to be in Florida. I will be by a pool, warm, for the first time all winter.
Hoping
real
that another
excited.
Storm doesn't hit Florida.
Oh, there's that. Last time we were in Florida, Hurricane Milton fucked up our trip. But that's not going to happen this time. I'm going to be warm, and it's going to be fine. Everything's going to be good. That's our pool day, too.
Fingers crossed.
It's fine, Arin. So, yeah, that's why we're doing the children's blizzard this week, because it's very topical to our life right now. And also, I needed something completely different from space and not even a man-made disaster. We're doing a straight-up natural disaster that, I mean, if you want to be mad at someone, be mad at God, I guess. But that's about it. So, yeah, are you ready to dive in? Do you have any questions, comments, and concerns?
Nope. Ready to press on.
Ready to be horrified.
Yeah, do your worst.
So, trigger warning for this one. This one does involve children dying.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't give a lot of trigger warnings, but the children ones get a trigger warning because that sucks.
Yeah.
That always sucks. But it's a good story. It's an interesting piece of history. So the quote this week is, "The dark, blinding, roaring storm once experienced ever remains an actual living presence that has maintained its pathway with ruin, desolation, and death."
Wow.
It's from Caleb Holt, a South Dakota historian, talking about this blizzard. This blizzard it's one of those watershed moments in an area. It took place in the Dakota territories all the way down through the Great Plains. It really was basically the whole heartland of the United States of America. It included Canada too, but the majority of what we're going to be talking about is in the United States of America.
I can always picture Canada frozen though.
True. And the plains I picked are frozen a lot too, to be honest. But this
North
is a
Dakota,
particular bad
South
one.
Dakota.
Yeah. So the prairie in the United States was one of the last places to be truly settled by white settlers. It was one of the last places that the Native Americans had a stronghold. By the time we reach the end of the 19th century, though, they are being unfortunately packed off to reservations, and people are really starting to flood into the plains. And part of why it took so long for it to be settled by, our manifest destiny ancestors is because it is such a hard place to live. Up until the really early to mid 20th century, on most maps it was labeled the Great American Desert, and in other maps it was just called straight up Indian Territory, and it was just kind of this amorphous mass in the middle of the country that nobody really stayed in because it was difficult to live there. It's difficult to stay there. Difficult to travel across it even for the pioneers that went out west. During the Gilded Age, however, we really start to see a lot of these white settlers coming in mass, and that's primarily because they were lured by the promise of free land for homesteading and propaganda advertising the area as some of the best farmland in the world. Look at how much grass can grow here. You can grow whatever you want. You don't have to dig up any trees. You don't have to remove any rocks. You can come and you can live here and it'll be great. The railroad companies were behind quite a bit of this. They owned a lot of land and they were able to sell it to the government, who then gave it to homesteaders, and obviously money. The Homestead Act happened in the mid 19th century, and this is the United States government giving everyone who came who wanted it. Well, everyone who came and was 21 years or older and had $18 for the filing fee could get 160 acres if they farmed it for 5 years.
Damn.
Yep, and then it was theirs, free and clear.
That's
Own
crazy.
it for as long as you want. In 3 decades after 1870, 225 million acres of prairie were broken, stripped of sod, planted with crops. More land than had ever been improved in the prior 263 years of white settlement on the Americas up until that point.
That is a lot.
A lot of people came. This was far and away the greatest human migration that we'd ever seen.
You said far and away. Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman.
Ew.
That kind of about that thing.
It is a little bit.
I just remember them going and claiming their spot of land.
Yeah. The majority of people who came to the prairies to claim that Homestead Act were immigrants, largely from Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries. There was quite a bit of propaganda purporting this in their countries, and they came in vast numbers. 16.5 million people, to be more precise, between 1850 and 1900 immigrated to the United States with the purpose of trying to move to the plains. Now, the majority of them didn't actually make it to the plains. Most of them ended up kind of stuck in East Coast cities because they spent all their money to get over here.
And they didn't
have enough to get, well, it's not just the $14. You needed $18 to pay for homesteading, but you also needed money to get on the train to get here.
And then
money
to set
up and all that stuff. So a lot of people would spend their entire life savings to get to the United States with the idea that they would work in these East Coast cities and save up enough to go out to the Great Plains. And then they found themselves stuck because they couldn't make enough to get out there. But yeah, 16.5 million people, the majority of which had intended to head out to the plains. But even with that, there were hundreds of thousands of people who did make it to the plains and claim these homesteads and try and make a go of it. And for the most part in the beginning, they considered this to be a great stroke of luck. They thought it was going to be wonderful.
Until. And
there's a side note, in our Big Burn episode, we talk about this a little bit without talking about it. Do you remember Pinky?
Vaguely.
Pinky was the super badass who rode the train on the top of the train. All the people got stuck in the lake, and so Pinky was in that area, that was Montana-ish. This is part of it. She claimed a homestead, and she was trying to homestead.
Okay.
And this is that time frame. This is years before that, but this is 12 years before the Big Burn. All right. Random side note. Yep. We're going to talk about fires here. In some cases, for the immigrants that were coming over, there were so many of them that literally entire villages would pack up together, move over to the States, claim homesteads next to each other, and form little communities. So all throughout the plains, a lot of it was really segregated by people who are from the same kind of geographic area in Europe, wherever it was in Europe they came from. And they
kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's pretty cool.
I'd always kind of assumed that it was, just people with similar backgrounds and nationalities or religion or whatever kind of grouped together.
That happened too a lot. But in some cases, literally whole villages would pack up together and do it together. And that wasn't the primary, but that is something that happened, which is cool, I think. The journey to get here was long and perilous. Things like shipwrecks were uncommon, but even if you did make it all the way and your ship didn't sink, if you were coming over as an immigrant, for the most part, you were going in steerage. And steerage was horrific. It was terrible. And this is just before the era of Titanic. And if you remember anything about Titanic, a lot of what they talk about is how great the steerage was. And the reason why is it was great comparatively to what they had been doing. Because before that beginning era of, giving steerage passengers actual, cabins, there might be 6 people in a cabin, but it's a cabin. They just stuck them in the hold. Masses of people stuck in the hold.
I actually know a bit about this one.
Yeah?
Yeah. Working for the Maritime Museum in San Diego, the Star of India had actually run immigrant passage at one point. And they had some exhibits on the in-between decks. We call them the tween decks. Not quite the cargo hold, but the deck above that. And there were, some that were just, you kind of slept out in these open bunks, single passenger passage. There were just, like 3 high, single bunk. That's what you got. And it was open to everything else. And then there were family cabins for, whole families. And there were 4 bunks in there, sometimes 3, but you would have like 2 families crammed into there.
And those would be nice accommodations because there were plenty of ships that didn't have bunks.
And on top of that, because the ships, they're working ships, this is the age of sail and all that, they were restricted. They got like maybe 30 minutes to an hour up on, if I'm remembering correctly.
If they even got to go up. A lot of times they didn't get to go on deck at all.
Exactly. So you had this restriction because the crew needed to work up there. So you're just stuck down. Imagine the smells.
And imagine when people died. Because there was a lot of people that would just straight up die, especially children, not coping well with the journey.
That much humanity just piled on top of each other. It breeds sickness. Because you're
not good.
You're not going up to the head, like we talked about, to drop your crap literally over the side. You're
pooping in a bucket.
Yep, shit in a bucket. Lucky. And then, someone has to carry that up and dump it. But that's not happening every time someone goes, and you're taking your meals down there. Like it's too close a proximity.
Yeah, it's a long, hard journey. And it doesn't get any easier.
Nope.
It just stays hard. Going on train to the prairie was very similar. You were just stuffed into like cattle cars and you paid for passage for these. Like, I just want to point out, you paid for the privilege of these horrible circumstances.
Be grateful.
Be grateful. And then when they got to the prairie worked against them as well. When we talk about plagues, we're usually talking about Egypt, but the reality is the Great American Plains have their own kind of set of plagues. There's really 3 of them. Okay. Grasshoppers, fire, and blizzards.
It makes sense because there's not a lot to blunt any weather.
No, the weather is horrific. And blizzards are the worst of the weather, but droughts, windstorms, tornadoes, these things are prevalent on the plains and not great.
When it's dry, all that grass dries out and then it's a fire hazard.
And then the grasshoppers come and eat everything else. It's not awesome. It was not as easy to make a living farming as that was made out to be. It was not El Dorado. It was not easy. And people, they got there and they did not have the ancestral knowledge that folks who have lived on the land for a long time have. And they had gotten rid of the Native Americans. It's not like they were nearby and helping. We were pretty shitty to the Native Americans. So no one really knew what it was supposed to be. And all of it was shocking to them, and all of it was horrible, and none of it is anything like anywhere in Europe. Just, if you don't live in the United States, or if you do live in the United States, tornadoes are not normal. That is not a thing that happens anywhere else in the world. That's not normal. Those kinds of blizzards, they don't happen anywhere else in the world. The Great Plains has some of the worst weather on the entire planet. And as Americans, we don't really think of it that way necessarily because it is so normalized in our culture and in our lives. Like, oh, they just get tornadoes sometimes that wipe entire fucking towns off the map. But that is not a thing that most people on this planet deal with.
Horizontal lightning.
We're going to talk about horizontal lightning. That is in this story.
That shit is wacky.
Horrible.
What the hell?
Again, if you live in the States, it's not normal. If you don't live in the States, just know that it's fucked up in the middle of the country here. It's not great.
To any of our potential listeners who are in the middle of the country, we're not bagging on you.
It's not your fault that your weather betrays you. You're amazing for still being there. Like, good on you. But I'm sorry. It's not normal. It's not your fault, but it's not normal. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, Thomas Edison is over here making motion pictures. In Chicago, electric lights are lighting up skyscrapers. This is the peak of the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Morgans, the Rockefellers building their just absolutely excessive mansions. And then in the middle of the country, we have just this chaos going on. People really trying to live that manifest destiny, the final frontier, really, the final pioneers trying to make a go of it. And there's a real dichotomy in the haves and have-nots.
Yeah.
In this context.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Of the disasters, like I said, weather is really the worst of the three plagues that plague the Great Plains. And again, if you live on the Great Plains, I like the Great Plains. I think it's really pretty.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really fascinating. The amount of just science that we've learned from looking at the Great Plains is really cool. But like, your weather sucks. It's a super bummer out there. Tornadoes suck. Blizzards suck. Droughts suck. And it's just nonstop. It's one after another.
So funny to me because tornadoes scare the crap out of me.
Oh, they're horrifying.
The concept of a tornado is like, it's freaky to me.
Mm-hmm.
But, as we talked about, we're from California and like everywhere else talks about, being scared of earthquakes. And we're like, eh.
But you know what? I'll just say earthquakes happen all over the world. There's so many places where plates meet, and there are just billions of people in humanity who deal with earthquakes on a daily basis. There's the Great fucking Plains who deal with tornadoes. Y'all are a different breed. Like, just saying. But so anyways, to go back to the story, the weather. The weather is awful. On January 7th, 1873, a horrible blizzard blasted through the Great Plains. And this is, the early times of all of these settlers coming in. One of the first major blizzards they had to deal with. It lasted for a total of 3 days.
Oh, God.
3 days worth of blizzards. The temperatures fell to 40 below zero.
No.
They don't have indoor heating.
What the?
They don't even have insulated homes unless they're living in a sod house. And that insulation is,
If we'll remember back to, a couple of years ago when the polar vortex broke up and that crazy storm came down through and it hit through the Midwest.
Because that does.
It fucked some shit up.
Yep.
With modern day homes and insulation. And
they didn't have that.
And
40 below.
All their stuff died and they're like burning newspapers or books or whatever in the fireplace to try and survive.
So imagine
that's ridiculous.
Pre any kind of modern technology.
I know. That's what I'm saying.
Very bad. It ended up killing 70 people in Minnesota alone. And many families were so poor that they couldn't attend the funerals of their loved ones because they didn't have proper clothing to be able to go out in that kind of weather. So yeah, that's good. 2 months later, another 3-day blizzard hit in March that time.
In March.
Much of the snow had melted before that blizzard hit, which had left many of the fields super, super muddy. Because the water didn't have anywhere to go. So when the winds whipped up, the mud intermixed with the snow, and it became like a mud snow blizzard for the first beginning of it before it froze the ground again.
Oh,
the Midwest is fucked. I love the Midwest.
Wow.
When I say the Midwest is fucked, please it's the weather. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. A few weeks after that March blizzard in April, another blizzard popped up in what is now South Dakota. And in a twist of fate, it happened while that General Custer, that we probably all know, was hanging out in the area with his troops. This one blew at an average of 52 miles an hour, so nearly hurricane force winds.
Oh, my God.
Townspeople ended up saving a number of his troops, including Custer himself. And for the next 3 years of his life before he died in the Battle of Little Bighorn, he sung the praises of the people of South Dakota for all of the help and benefaction they gave him and his troops, which I thought was just an interesting little piece of history that General Custer dealt with this shit too.
Yeah, that's you talk about the wind speed through there, and I'm just cold thinking about it.
I know. It's our blizzard feels much better after doing the
Oh,
research
ours
on
wasn't
this.
even really like a blizzard.
The winter of 1880 and 81 was called the snow winter because it was basically just one giant blizzard all winter, just near constant. A 3-day blizzard started on October 15th, and after that, the snow came at regular intervals every couple of days all winter and into much of spring. In some places, the snow from that first October storm was still on the ground as of May. There was so much snow that children would sled down hills from their second-story roofs. Many of the crops died that year before being harvested because the snow started so early in October. So there was a lot of people that were starving that winter as well. The train service was entirely suspended by that January because the tracks were lost in the snow and no one could keep them free of snow. They didn't end up resuming service again until June 14th, 4.5 months later.
So no shipments of goods either.
Nope, nothing.
Ooh.
It was not uncommon for people to lose appendages, like have amputations from frostbite at this time, especially in that winter. When the snow finally melted, much of the prairie was flooded, and it was so flooded that folks had to use makeshift boats to get around.
Jesus.
That winter in particular was a big subject of Laura Ingalls Wilder's book, The Long Winter. The TV show about it, Little House on the Prairie, makes it look very fluffy and friendly. I don't know if you've read the book. I'm going to guess not from that.
No, I've seen the show.
I read the book. I read a lot of her
growing up.
books. Loved them. But her books are so much darker than the show makes it look. Like little girls talking about what they would do if they died in a blizzard and how they would try and avoid dying in a blizzard, and just like an acceptance of the fact that, yeah, sometimes you die in blizzards. It's okay. No big deal. Whatever. And it's really reflective of how the people looked at it, though, because these were the countries and the areas that many of these settlers came from were not known for being, exuberantly emotional. There's a running joke in the Norwegian community that at this time where an old farmer was having such a fit of emotion that he told his friend, "I love my wife so much I almost told her." And that's just like, that's these people, these immigrants, that's kind of how they dealt with things. They were not very outwardly emotional. So like
stoic.
They didn't, they didn't talk about it, and they didn't worry about it. Like sometimes you die. That is what it is. The next really bad winter after that one was the 87-88 winter, and this was known as the winter of blue snow. Only really bad winters that have consistent storms get names. So we have 2 so far in just the minor time frame they've been there.
Awesome.
Now, before this winter, there was this kind of burgeoning cattle empire forming in the Great Plains. When the Native Americans were moved out of the Great Plains, a lot of Texas ranchers bought up a bunch of land in the plains thinking, oh, look at all this grass. It's basically free. The cattle can graze forever, and we won't have to buy hay. We won't have to do these things.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt actually bought quite a bit of land and had a cattle farm in the area. So there was quite a number of cattle going at this point up until basically this winter. This winter functionally killed the cattle industry in the Midwest, like single-handedly. It was so bad. The winter was horrible, but what made it so much worse was that the preceding summer before that, there was a drought that killed off much of the grass, and the grass it didn't kill off was burned off in a fire.
Of course.
So going into winter, the cattle were going into it skinny. They didn't have a lot of fat to be able to keep them warm when things went bad. Much like the 81 winter, it was just a cycle of blizzard after blizzard, basically one giant blizzard. It would be 2-3 days of blizzard, then 2-3 days of just blazingly cold wind, maybe a few hours of calm, and then restart another blizzard over and over and over and over again.
So what I'm hearing is basically every year sucked.
Pretty much. By that spring, diseases ended up breaking out all over the area because thousands of dead cattle were clogging all of the riverways.
Oh, gross.
Just floating down because so many of them died. And the Midwest cattle industry never really picked up to those levels again. I mean, there's people who cattle farm in those areas now, but it's not nearly what it was in the, mid to late 19th century.
Wow.
Much of the weather systems were known to meteorologists, the burgeoning meteorologist community. At this time, the United States did have a National Weather Service. It was run by the Army, the Signal Corps, and they had very few stations through the country that had people making actual predictions. The majority of the predictions were done in Washington, D.C., and then sent out over telegram.
How,
They did have one in St. Paul, though.
how do you make predictions for weather across the country from...
So the way they did it at this time was way more empirically based. So they knew, for example, in the Great Plains, when it got warm for a couple of days in winter, that probably meant that there was a cold front coming behind it. And they had tons of people in little spaces on weather stations who would report what the barometric pressure was and what the temperature was, and they could make general predictions based off of the information they were getting in somewhat real time.
So they relayed the information.
Yeah. So this isn't
across
great.
the country.
Yeah.
To a central point.
Well, so most of the stuff happened in DC, but the Midwest did have a station in St. Paul, and that's what made the predictions for the Midwest and the South.
I didn't necessarily mean like centralized in the middle of the country. I meant centralized, like one or two decision points.
Yep.
Okay.
So they had some rudimentary abilities. It certainly is not, the modern weather service. Now, to be clear, the Weather Service was primarily in existence to help wealthy farmers in the southern states protect their crops. It was not there to protect the settlers. It had an added benefit of maybe doing that sometimes, but their goal really was primarily to support those wealthy farmers. And that's where a lot of the votes came from for senators and congressmen who were supporting this and all of that. So, just to be clear, it wasn't St. Paul. They did make predictions for the area, but that really was not considered their focus. Because even in the late 19th century, we're still dealing with conglomerates. So that's where we are. The January 12th blizzard was not missed entirely by the Weather Service. We're going to talk about it a bit more as we go there. But a combination of not wanting to be wrong, not fully realizing how bad it would be, led to a delay of putting up what are called cold weather or cold wave warning flags. This is how they warned people about what was going on. They'd put out a cold wave warning, and then they'd fly a black and white flag in towns. And that's how they would distribute the information. And just as we're going into this, they didn't miss it. They knew. But there was such a delay.
Okay.
I guess it's not fair to say they knew. They could have known.
All right.
But a series of just problems led to this becoming so much worse than it necessarily needed to be, maybe. But the reality is those flags in the middle of towns weren't as helpful for homesteaders that weren't even allowed to put their homesteads right next to each other. They had to have their houses quite separate just based on the homestead laws. So it's an imperfect system on the best of times.
So the homestead laws kept them from grouping their houses together?
Yeah, they weren't allowed to have their houses right next to each other. They had to be a certain distance apart.
That's weird.
Yeah, I don't know the reasoning for it, but that was one of the rules of the homestead laws. Everything had to be pretty spread out. So when you have a central point to disseminate information and everything is super spread out, it's just by its very nature an imperfect system. So here we are, the winter of 87-88. Okay. It is another pretty terrible winter. This time, it was particularly bad.
Oh, the winter between 87 and 88. Got you. Sorry.
Yeah, because the winter starts in 87 and it finishes in 88.
Sorry, it took my brain just a second.
This winter was particularly bad for wheat, rye, and potato country.
Okay. Those
areas that grew those crops just got hit really, really hard in particular. There was 2 months of below zero weather before we got to January on its own. This time, the actual blizzards had started around Thanksgiving and had been pretty relentless and unforgiving. The 2 weeks leading up to January 12th, 1888 had been straight horrific. 20 below zero, horrid conditions through and through, all the way up until the morning of January 12th, 1888. It wasn't uncommon in these horrible winters to have a really nice day in between the blizzards where it would stay just mellow for the whole day. And with how awful it had been, people were really psyched about having a nice mellow day where it was above freezing. The weather felt really, really good. When these things happened, especially after such a horrid period of time, it almost became like an unofficial holiday. Folks were as close as these people get to dancing in the streets.
That makes a lot of sense.
They're going out, they're getting their chores done, they're going into town, they're checking in on neighbors, they're doing everything that they've been wanting to do for weeks but unable to do. Many of them are going out without overcoats or hats or bringing any kind of warm weather clothing for them. And that includes children who haven't been able to go to school for weeks and are finally able to go into school. And a lot of them were very excited to go see their friends again and be able to go. And now these are not schools like what we know today. Most of these schools are like one-room schoolhouses that were built by the settlers themselves.
Like Little House on the Prairie.
Like Little House on the Prairie. It was literally the first time in weeks that people could be outside without literally being in pain. It was almost a 40-degree temperature rise in under 24 hours. I want to emphasize what a nice day it started as. It started so good. Some, it didn't sit right. There were folks that had been on the prairie long enough to know that while it looks nice, it doesn't always stay nice. Certainly it does sometimes, but sometimes the weather turns real fast and you don't know when it's going to. So there were some families who kept their children home from school and didn't go out with their concerns of what might happen.
Okay.
Thankfully. All of the pieces of the puzzle were there for the National Weather Service to figure out that it was going to turn, that things were going to go poorly. Each day, the Weather Service would put out their predictions like we talked about what was going to happen. If it was going to be a cold wave, black and white flags. If it was going to be warm, nothing really happened. And at this point, Thomas Mayhew Woodruff was the overseer of the St. Paul Weather Service area.
Okay.
And he saw that this warm front was coming through, and he knew that a warm front usually precedes a cold front, and knew there was a good chance that there would be really cold weather coming behind it. And usually the warmer the warm area is, the worse the cold front behind it is going to be. And he ultimately made the decision not to put out a cold wave warning because he didn't have any empirical data. None of the stations further north were getting colder weather yet, which is usually what he would look for, right? Okay. So it's warm down here in South Dakota, but it's cold up there in Canada. You put out a cold wave warning to South Dakota because you know that cold is coming down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Everything was warm, though. Could he have made a better choice? Maybe. But hindsight's 20/20. And given the technology that he had to work with, he made the best decision I think that he could. What he didn't know was that the way the weather systems were set up in the Great Plains that day, something that modern meteorologists would have been able to figure out, was creating essentially a giant wind tunnel from Canada all the way down to Mexico.
Oh, God.
Just a giant sheer blast that could rip right through. And with how warm the weather was and how moist the air was, the potential for just truly catastrophic storms was right there. And as you know, we wouldn't be here if it didn't go poorly. It's going to go poorly. 173 miles northeast at the Fort Assinbone weather station, the first kind of signs of trouble started when the air started to really fill with quite a bit of static electricity. There was so much static electricity in the air that the telegraph wires were emitting little flashes of sparks. They were so charged they couldn't even be touched and handled. Like there was just so much power in the air at that point. It was something that the telegraph operators there had never seen before. And pretty quickly after that started, the weather outside started to turn absolutely brutal. The warm winds that had been going all day was starting to turn to ice, and winds were approaching 50 miles per hour, close to hurricane strength winds.
No, thank you.
They could not easily send a telegraph to St. Paul because of the amount of static electricity in that telegraph room. Wow. So they're not getting the warning yet. That warning is delayed because of the static electricity. The winds in that front were starting to move across the plains. They were moving at a rate of 45 miles per hour. And there's no cold wave put out to anyone. Nobody knows that this is coming for them. And it's coming for them
really fast.
The wind tunnel that had the potential of forming, had activated, and the cold front was moving through the plains like a curtain of ice, separating two wildly different climates. On one side, it was warm and mild, and on the other side, it was unbelievably cold, and the winds and snow were so intense that there was just straight up no visibility. It was too cold to produce what we normally think of as snowflakes, the lovely kind of floating lace-like structures. Instead, what the storm was performing the pretty ones.
Yeah.
Instead, this storm is producing basically just needles of ice that are blowing through everything. They were just spiky structures being tossed at 50 miles per hour, all in just like a jumble of things. Just really, really horrific. The only thing that's required to make a storm...
hail.
Very much. The only thing that's required to make a storm a blizzard is winds of 35 miles per hour, airborne crystals, and temperatures of 20 degrees or lower. At this point, the January 12th storm isn't even at its peak yet, and it clearly qualifies.
Yeah.
So it no longer requires 35 mile per hour winds. Side note.
Really?
No, it just needs ice crystals being slammed through the air and below 20. That's why ours wasn't considered a blizzard. Just a random side note. Something I learned this week. So as this storm is coming along, it's literally breaking out with like no warning as it hits these towns. It's coming in like just almost a tsunami of bad weather, because it is quite literally one side, beautiful day, other side, horrific. Temperatures between the two would drop as much as 20-25 degrees in less than 3 minutes as it blew in.
Wow.
It was
That's a huge change.
Essentially a wall of ice coming at people without ice needles coming at people without any warning. It was unprecedented in its horror and how abrupt and brutal it was. The air was so thick with fine ground ice crystals that folks and animals were just suffocated in many cases, unable to breathe through it, almost like a dust storm, but an ice dust storm.
I hadn't, that is not something that had occurred to me as a possibility.
It's the thing.
Wow.
Now, we have not seen a storm like this since. This was very much a once in a lifetime, really once in several lifetimes kind of storm, but it is a thing that exists. So, I'm telling you, the Midwest, they're not a lucky location. This storm hit Montana just before dawn. It rolled into North Dakota in the morning, South Dakota during the school's morning recess, and Nebraska as the school's dismissed. Over the course of one night in Helena, the temperatures dropped a total of 50 degrees in 4.5 hours. So they have that initial drop in under 3 minutes, but by the time 4.5 hours have passed, 50 degrees lower than what it started. The warm weather on the plains was actually fuel for the storm itself at this point, and the further it got, the worse it got, because it was being fed by all of this warm air that accumulated in the plains, so it's getting worse and worse as it comes forward and forward.
Brr.
There were a number of weather observers whose job it was to report back to the main office in St. Paul that were seeing these telegrams come through about the weather changing and knew that this was coming and it was going to be a huge problem. And you would see them starting to go out into the streets yelling at people, but not putting up the flags that like, there's going to be a blizzard. It's on its way. You guys need to get home. And they were able to save a number of lives doing that, but not as many as you would hope. Because again, people, well, more of them are in town than usual. They're still pretty spread out, and they weren't allowed to put up those cold wave flags until it was officially called for by the St. Paul office. These are military workers. These are it's the army. So they're not allowed to do it until they have permission to do it. So they're not doing it. They're just going out in the street and calling and saying these things are happening.
They're doing something.
They're doing the best they can.
I hate that, like, that black and white adherence to regulation. Like, there's some things that, like, just make common sense.
You would think,
but... I've dealt with this plenty in the Navy, where it's like, that's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard.
Yep.
The regulations say that, but this situation is completely,
They were still dumb in 1888. It's not new.
You mean we're still dumb now?
We're actually, that's a better way to put it. As the blizzard approached different areas, it literally looked to observers like the sky was just filling and bulging open. Account after account talks about how there had never been anything even remotely like this before. Allie Green was 15 years old in Clark County in eastern Dakota Territory. She said, quote, "We could see the blizzard coming across Spirit Lake. It was just as still as could be. We saw it cut off the trees like it was a white roll coming. It hit with 60-mile-per-hour wind. It had snowed the night before, just about 2 or 3 inches. It sucked up the snow into the air and nearly smothered you." Others described it as a gray wall coming at them.
That's terrifying.
Absolutely. Others described it as looking like great bales of cotton rolling across the plains at them, each one bound with what looked like silvery ropes as the wind whipped through them. 25 feet high, and above them the sky looked completely clear. That's not going to help you, because you're definitely below 25 feet, but what a a crazy thing to see it going on. And those were the lucky ones because they saw it and were able to get inside when they saw it coming. Others didn't see it coming, and it just struck them without any warning.
Mm.
When this storm hit buildings, it hit with a roar. Many of them had their roofs torn clear off, windows blown in, doors blown in, almost like a tornado or a hurricane, except this time with ice shards and making more of them every single second. Visibility was nearly zero. In many places, you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face because of how quickly it got dark. It was so cold, the eyelashes were freezing to people's eyes. Their eyelids are just freezing together in just, a minute or two.
Wow.
There were multiple reports of folks wiping their eyes so much, trying to get that ice off of it. And the roughness of the ice and the constant rubbing rubbed their cheeks down to the point that you could see their cheekbones.
Oh, what?
Ripping the skin, because it was freezing the skin and they're rubbing it off over and over. And it ripped off so much skin.
No.
See their cheek.
Good God.
Oh, I love you. Not to mention, obviously, quite a bit of frostbite because so many people were just dramatically underdressed for any kind of cold weather, much less something this horrific.
Yeah.
They had all gone out. It was a beautiful day in their, almost summer clothes. So they didn't have coats on. They didn't have hats. They didn't have gloves. Like, frostbite was a huge, huge problem.
You're going to ask me this summer why I'm packing a winter jacket.
Now, many children were in schoolhouses when the storm struck. And it was a really mixed bag what teachers did at this point. Blizzards were not an uncommon occurrence. A lot of children knew what to do in case of a blizzard. So some teachers made the choice to just send the children home as soon as the weather hit, thinking that it would be better for them to be in their more insulated homes and where there's, food and family than for them to stay in the schoolhouse. But other teachers realized that this is not normal and kept their children there, but it's a mixed bag. And there were definitely children who, as young as 6, were just sent out into this blizzard to go home.
That's awful.
Absolutely fucking horrific. For some...
Even a normal blizzard, like, what the fuck?
I mean, yes, but also there's so many different variables in this. Some of these teachers were new to the area and didn't understand blizzards. They thought it was going to get better quicker and that this was the best course of actions for their kids. In other cases, they did keep the kids there for a while and then they ran out of fuel. And they weren't able to keep the schoolhouse warm anymore because they didn't have a ton of fuel stored up. And it's not like they could go out to the shed to get more easily anyway. So, like, they had to make choices. And certainly some of them were just making shitty choices. But a lot of times, you don't know what you're going to do in a tough situation. So, that's what it is. Folks who were caught out in it were pretty much universally trapped. They're unable to see, their warmth being ripped away, their spit freezing on their lips, their tears freezing inside of their eyelids. There's just horrific. There's not much they can do here. There was a number of cows found in the days after that were frozen solid, standing upright with their faces frozen to the ground from their own breath.
What?
This is how bad it was. Like, this is the reason I watched Day After Tomorrow the other day, because it feels very much like the Day After Tomorrow.
So,
the great
like,
freeze
just
that went
flash frozen cow.
And a lot of times, like, yes, essentially.
Goodness gracious.
Dr. Louis W. Unchelli, director of the National Centers for Environmental Prediction and an expert on snowstorms, talks about this in a couple of her research essays.
Okay.
And she says the most comparable phenomena we have in recent memory that we can kind of relate to it to understand just how quickly and just ferociously it came upon people isn't a snowstorm at all. It's the debris cloud from when the Twin Towers fell in New York City. The way that ripped through the city of New York, that's much like what this blizzard would have done through the Great Plains. And when you picture that in your head of that debris cloud just billowing through with all the different debris in it and how quickly it was hitting people and how dangerous it was. Picture that, but a snowstorm just rolling across the empty plains at you.
Wow.
The snow and particles were the snow and just other particles in the air, so like dirt and just things that were hanging out in the atmosphere were pulverized into basically like talcum powder consistency. So they would have burrowed into the best winter coats if anybody had been wearing them. Homespun cloth was no impediment to that kind of snow. It didn't help whatsoever. The system that is
it's just
formed,
embedding itself in their skin.
Pretty much, yes. Just absolutely horrific because it's like talcum powder needles burrowing into you constantly at 50 miles an hour.
Nope.
The system that had formed was a type of anticyclone. It was sucking in cold air at the bottom and spitting it out the top. And part of that included an excess of static electricity on the air as well, forming what basically amounts to horizontal thunderstorms and horizontal lightning, made up of static electricity due to all the different types of things interacting: cold air and warm air, cold ice structures and warm sod homes, wet particles and dry dirt. Sailors used to call this phenomena St. Elmo's fire. Meteorologists now call it corona. Meteorologists now call it corona or point discharge. And it also came with quite a bit of thunder snow, but nobody could hear it over the roars of the wind.
Thunder snow?
Thunderstorm with snow, but a horizontal thunderstorm with horizontal lightning.
Oh my God.
At the height of the blizzard, folks who were indoor and could actually see each other watched as their hair rose straight up from their scalp. They watched as putting the pokers in their fires that they were trying to get going because it's so freezing cold sparked constantly all the way up the poker and back down it.
No, thank you.
Can you imagine the supernatural feel of that, being in your home and suddenly everyone's hair is just standing on end and everything is sparking?
Fucking freaky.
Absolutely horrific.
Terrifying.
In one of the most famous stories, a teacher named Lois Royce in Plainsview, Nebraska, found herself trapped with three students in a schoolhouse as the blizzard started to rage. Realizing that they could not stay there without food or fuel, she attempted to lead them to the nearest farmhouse, which was less than a mile away. She had 2 9-year-old boys and a 6-year-old girl with her. They couldn't find their way. Within a few steps from getting outside of the schoolhouse, they could not see at all. And they tried to stumble around for a while, but pretty quickly the kids couldn't walk anymore. So Lois laid them down with her, covered them with her coat, and tried to hold them against her body to keep them warm until somebody hopefully found them. Unfortunately, no one did. All 3 of the children ended up dying. Lois survived. And when the storm abated, pure luck. When the storm abated, she was able to crawl on her hands and knees a quarter of a mile to the nearest farmhouse, where she was rescued and thawed out, and she ended up surviving.
Oh my God.
17-year-old teacher Minnie Freeman became an absolute legend after saving her entire class. When the storm started to blow apart the flimsy sod schoolhouse, blowing in the door multiple times even after they nailed it shut and then eventually starting to blow the roof off, she tied all of her students together with twine and led them through the blizzard to a nearby farmhouse.
That sounds so familiar.
You've heard of it, I'm sure. This is a very famous story.
Huh.
It's been memorialized in a number of different places, including the song called Minnie Freeman's Brave Deed. It's a very famous story. But all of her children survived, including her, which is amazing. Such a wonderful story. 8-year-old Walter Allen was attending a school in Groton, a town on the Northern Plains. He was one of the kids who was fucking psyched to go back to school that day. He was 8, and he had a very special job of being row monitor. And row monitor means that you're in charge of collecting people's coats and shoes when they get there and then handing them back out at the end of the day. And apparently this was the highlight of Walter Allen's life. The storm struck his school at around 10:30 a.m. with an absolutely violent rattling of all the doors and the windows. His teachers had originally decided to try and release the children to go home on their own, but by the time they got all of their stuff together and opened the doors, they realized that this would be absolute death if they sent the kids out on this on their own.
Good they realized it.
It is. So they went back inside, and visibility was so bad that none of the children nor the teachers saw as a group of 10 men with 5 drays, which are like just kind of carts being pulled behind horses, pulled up to rescue the children. It was a number of the children's fathers who had come together to go and get their kids from the schoolhouse and bring them home. So the teachers did a head count, loaded all the kids up, and sent them on their way, confident that the men would get the children home safely. Walter was one of the last kids out. He was bound and determined as row monitor to make sure that all of his row mates made it into the dray and made it safely. After he hopped on, though, he realized that he had left his little perfume bottle that he used to wipe off his blackboard inside, and he was afraid if he left it there, it would freeze and burst, and he wouldn't be able to afford a new one. So he jumped off the dray and ran back into the schoolhouse to get his little perfume bottle. And by the time he came back out, he could not see where the drays were anymore. And the teachers were gone too, and he was alone. There wasn't really anything he could do at this point. Without thinking, because 8, he decided he could make it home on his own. So he started out he tried to walk home, and he did not make it very far before he finally just kind of collapsed and curled in on himself because it was too cold. He didn't have enough clothes. He laid there for quite a while, but when the drays made it to his house, they realized that Walter was not on it. And Walter's father and his brother convinced the men who were on the drays to go back and look for him. So all of that group went back and started looking for Walter at the schoolhouse. The adults were standing. They were going inside, searching through the schoolhouse, walking around. Visibility is horrific, so they're having a hard time finding him. And the adults, they looked for a while, but realized they don't know where he is. And if they stay out there, they're all going to die.
Yeah.
So they make the decision to go home. So everyone, except for Walter's older brother, gets on the drays and goes home. Walter's older brother had heard that the best way to deal with a snowstorm is to get under it, that the lower you get, the better things are. So he was on his hands and knees, crawling around, looking for little Walter.
Oh, my God.
He found him.
Really?
He found Walter, but he found him after all of the adults had left. And all of the adults apparently just didn't notice that he wasn't with them. But he found Walter, and he picks up Walter, and he ends up carrying him the 3/4 of a mile it was to get back to their home. And he didn't make it all the way home. Their home was right next to their father's law office, like within a couple dozen feet.
Okay.
He made it to the law office before he was just collapsing. Done.
Right.
Couldn't do it anymore. He managed to drag Walter into the law office, light a fire, warm up a little bit, and then went back home, which was right about there next door, told his parents, and they were all able to come back and get Walter back into the house. So Walter actually survived in a just truly miraculous rescue by his big brother. Like, beautiful story. Unfortunately, Walter's perfume bottle did freeze and explode while he was there. And in his memoirs, he's still pretty pissed about it.
All that work.
And
now, near misfortune.
I know.
For it to
he lived. Lucky kid.
Yeah, I did not expect that.
I got worse ones, don't worry. Etta was a 19-year-old school teacher in Nebraska. Her father had started a homestead after the Civil War and took advantage of a provision in it that allowed him to own the land for less time because of his service in the Union Army. He had already left the plains by this point because he was just sick and tired and done with the
weather.
Yep, but Etta had stayed behind to work as a school teacher to help support the family. She was set to go back to her father and her family on January 13th, the next day. The only reason she was still there was because she needed to collect her last paycheck of $25. Once she'd done that, she was going to be on a train going back to her family. When the blizzard struck, she was walking to collect her final paycheck.
Oh, man.
When the blizzard hit, it was so sudden that the folks she was boarding with, who had been watching her walk down the road to get to picking up her final paycheck, saw her one moment and then couldn't the next.
Whoa.
They tried screaming out the door to help her get back to the home, but she didn't come, either because she couldn't hear them or what, but she didn't. Yeah. They tried for a while, but they were too afraid to actually go out into the storm to rescue her because the visibility was so bad. So they didn't go out after her. And this is a running theme in a lot of the stories that, understandably so. It's not safe to go out in that.
What do you do when you can't see?
What do you do when you can't see? So Etta set out to find shelter, but she quickly became lost in the absolute whiteout conditions. The storm's winds were so strong that it was impossible to see, and the freezing temperatures made her survival extremely unlikely. But miraculously, Etta ended up finding a haystack, and she crawled inside, using it as insulation against the deadly cold. She ended up remaining trapped in there, though, because the weight of the snow acted like a vice. So even after the storm stopped, her upper body was still stuck inside. Her legs hadn't fit inside the haystack, so they were frozen solid. And she could not crawl out of it. And she survived for 3 days stuck in that haystack before Mr. Murphy found her inside of it when he was going to feed his cows.
God.
In that time, she talked about how she remembers being chewed on by mice and considered it a blessing because it meant she was still alive. And she was able to stay awake by singing hymns and saying prayers.
Okay. Different breed of people.
Then,
oh man.
Unfortunately, despite medical efforts, amputations, and other just traumatic things, Etta ended up dying of her injuries on February 6th or 7th because
Oh, okay. So
you're not going to do
she didn't,
that.
when you said memoirs, I thought she lived to older age.
No, memoirs isn't the right word, just things that she talked about. And she did write some things down in that interim, but she ended up passing away due to her injuries.
I mean, both her legs get frozen solid.
Both of her legs, yeah, it's pretty bad. Johann Albrich's mother had tried to keep him and his brother Peter home from school that day, but being 13 and oh so worldly, Johann had appealed to his father, who had given him permission to go, and he was at school when the blizzard hit. His teacher was a boarder at his house, so lived with him, and his name was Mr. James P. Cotton. There were 7 boys at school that day, so a total of 8 people, including Mr. Cotton.
Okay.
When the blizzard rocked the school at 11 o'clock that morning, it was almost instantaneous darkness and rattling of all windows and doors within minutes. And the wind sucked all of the warmth out of the uninsulated schoolhouse. Powdery snow was sifting in through all of the cracks in the walls and the window frames, spraying the children. The younger ones looking to their older brothers for what to do, trusting that they would, take care of them. The older boys wanted to stay in the school because that's what they'd been taught. When a blizzard hits, you stay indoors and you stay together, regardless of where it is. You huddle together for body warmth. You do not go out into it. But Mr. Cotton thought this was a bad idea. There was a house nearby, and he wanted them to go out into the storm to stay with that family nearby, both to find food and warmth. It was a grabber's place and less than a quarter mile away. In whiteout conditions, with no warm clothes.
Freezing.
The boys were quite concerned about it, but as most children of that time, they were well trained to obey and listen to their teacher. The 2 older boys went first, and soon all 8 were outside, huddled up behind the south wall of the schoolhouse, the only place that they could stand upright. Within a few paces after that, the boys had been split into 2 groups. There was Peter Grabber, Johann Kaufmann, Henrik and Elias Kaufmann staying with Johann Albricht as well. Mr. Cotton was with the other 2 children. It all happened so fast that the survivors have a hard time recollecting exactly how they got separated and how they ended up working that out. Mr. Cotton and the 2 children he was with made it to the Grabber home relatively quickly, but the other 5 boys didn't. 5 days after the blizzard, their tracks were found. Sometimes there was a set of 5 tracks, sometimes a set of 3, indicating that the older boys had carried the younger brothers for a time, multiple times in a row.
I'm amazed there were tracks.
It's amazing that there were tracks. When their bodies were finally found, Johann was holding his little brother Elias in his arms, and most of the other boys were holding to each other as well, frozen together and frozen to the ground. A 9-year-old boy in Nebraska was out with his dog when the storm overtook them. That evening, the dog turned up scratching at a neighbor's house, and the boy's coat wasn't found until March, and eventually his body was recovered that much later. I'm so sorry. Robert Chambers, a farmer, was outside watering his cattle with his 2 sons and their Newfoundland dog when the weather turned. Chambers sent the oldest boy home immediately because he suffered from rheumatism. Then he and his 9-year-old Johnny went to work trying to drive the cattle back to the barn, trusting that the dog would lead them, but they were quickly overtaken and bewildered. When Chambers realized that there was no hope of finding the farmhouse, he burrowed deep into a drift, wrapped Johnny in his jacket and vest, and kind of threw the boy into the hollow and out of the wind. Robert and the dog screamed and barked frantically, hoping that somebody would hear them, but no one did. By that evening, Chambers couldn't do any more, so he got into the drift with his son, bringing the dog in too, and refused to leave his boy. The next morning, the dog and Johnny were alive, but Robert wasn't. A rescue party found them when they heard the dog barking. By that point, Johnny was entirely buried except for his mouth, which the dog had kept licking and keeping him from being completely suffocated by the snow. He would not have survived much longer. And really, that dog, good dog.
Good dog.
Good dad, good dog. Those are the worst of the personal stories I'm going to tell you, but now I'm just going to kind of fucking ruin your life even more. So, freezing to death is a hard business.
Yeah.
The body works really hard not to let it happen. We create our own heat as warm-blooded animals, but with that, we also release it. And when things are working right, we can replenish our heat faster than it disappears. But when it's too cold and hypothermia starts setting in, that process becomes far more difficult. One of the first ways we humans lose heat is through the tops of our heads. We lose about 60% of our heat. Aaron just put his hood on through the top of our heads, much like how the earth radiates off heat. We're radiating it out that way as well. When we have a hat, we can contain more of it, but many of the people who are in these circumstances weren't wearing a hat that day. However, it's always a good idea to wear a nice hat when you're out in the cold. It helps a lot.
As someone who doesn't have a lot or hardly any hair,
Aaron really needs hats.
The knit cap is pretty key.
It's important, but strike one for these poor settlers. Most of them weren't wearing hats. As it gets colder, our bodies start to pull blood away from non-essential parts to keep the essential ones working. This is why our fingers, our toes, our noses, and our ears are the most prone to frostbite. Your body knows that it can live without a finger, but it can't live without your major organs. In cases like snow where your clothes are wet, you lose heat even faster. The wet sucks away even more of your body heat faster than you can replenish it. Even water at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, being immersed in it, can quickly induce immersion hypothermia. In the case of those trapped in this blizzard, this would have been happening constantly, both because their clothing was wet and because of just how wet the atmosphere was at that point. The snow would fall on them, it would melt, they'd be covered in this layer of water that was much, much colder than 60 degrees. So hypothermia was setting in far faster than it would in regular conditions. Convection is another way that heat is lost. You produce your own heat, almost like a little bubble of hot air. In our space episode, we talked about how, because there's no wind in the space shuttle and no gravity, all of their heat was able to stay in them in a bubble.
Yeah.
Right? But in the case of being in a blizzard with winds blowing at 50 plus miles per hour, your little heat envelope is whisked away from you as fast as it's made, and your body continues to try and replenish it harder and harder, and it becomes more and more difficult. This is actually where the term wind chill comes from. When we hear wind chill or real feel, what we're thinking is, it feels like it's 2 degrees, even though it's 18 degrees out. It's not that. Wind chill is actually a scientific determination. For example, it may be 18 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but with wind chill, it feels like 8 degrees. What that means is your body is going to lose heat like it's 8 degrees outside, even though it's 18 degrees because of that wind chill.
Huh.
So
that's fascinating.
It is. And we talk about it as real feel and stuff like that, but that's not what it is. It's how fast your body is losing body heat. So air moving at 8 miles per hour saps the body heat of you 4 times more than wind moving at 4 miles per hour. At 20 miles per hour, 25 times more body heat is lost than 4 miles per hour. When most folks left that morning, the wind chill was about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, so above zero. By the time the sun dropped, it was more than 40 degrees below zero. In conditions like that, flesh flash freezes in under 10 minutes, and people were out in it for hours.
How did some of these people, the survivors?
Luck. A lot of it is luck. And, the human body is designed, it works very hard to survive, and you can freeze and thaw out. Freezing is one of those things that you can come back from more easily because all of your body systems slow down. So I imagine that has a role to play in it as well.
Well, isn't that the thing about frostbite is when limbs actually like freeze through because when water freezes, it crystallizes. Yeah. And that jagged crystalline structure breaks the cell membranes.
So a lot of people came out of this with no feet, no arms, but they're still alive.
Fair enough.
And that's a thing. So to continue on horrifying you with freezing to death, once you get to a certain point, your brain starts to tell your body to shiver. This is one of our last resort attempts to warm ourselves back up. This is helpful in the short run. Moving your muscles and keeping the blood flowing through them helps keep things going. It helps prevent you from dying. But it also consumes oxygen at 2 to 3 times the normal amount, which accelerates your metabolism and quickly burns through whatever food you had last. And for people in these circumstances, most of them, their last meal would have been around 12 that day, if they were lucky. And some of the kids who were, brought their lunch to school, and not the farmers who, were just going to go home for lunch or whatever. So that's if you were lucky. Terror and exhaustion also consume quite a bit of heat. So there's a lot of different ways we lose it, a lot of ways we try and bring it back, but it's not fun. At 95 degrees, bodies start to exhibit the first signs of hypothermia, usually mental confusion and fogginess. This is where mountaineering and exploring parties that run into trouble start to argue and group breakdown begins. The term in that community is cold stupid.
95 degrees?
When your body temperature gets to 95 degrees, that's when mild hypothermia starts to kick in.
Huh.
It's not that low.
No.
Nope. After that mild hypothermia starts to kick in. You start to fall into a state of deeper hypothermia around 91 degrees. This is characterized by apathy. This is where you start to give up. You lay down. You don't care anymore. It's fine. And this is also when the muscles really start to break down. Frozen blocks of hands and feet. Once you try and contract a muscle, you can't relax it again. You can't really walk, but you don't really care that you can't walk. Everything is just kind of not working anymore.
Oof.
This is also about when shivering stops. Somewhere between 90 and 91 degrees body temperature. And once that happens, the body starts to shut down rapidly. If you were to look at a graph and see how quickly you lose body heat, so you lose maybe 1 degree every 5 minutes, that scale from 98.6 to 90 degrees is kind of like a gentle mountain slope.
Okay.
It takes a while. But once you get to 90 degrees, it's like falling off a cliff. Everything just goes wrong very quickly once you hit 90 degrees. This is where vital organs start to shut down. Blood starts to thicken. Hearts start to stiffen.
Ooh.
This deepening cold also radically redistributes body fluids. During the first hours of blood retreating from the skin into the core, that temporary rise of blood volume in the core results in an increased production of urine. Victims of hypothermia often wet themselves, which decreases the blood volume, which makes it harder to retain heat. This quickly becomes a cycle that happens over and over again, which also leads to pretty severe dehydration.
Yeah.
This means, as well, less oxygen is required to keep the brain alive. And with modern medicine, the phrase, "you're not dead until you're warm and dead," applies in a lot of situations because you can sometimes bring people back from this. If you warm them up slowly, you make sure you hydrate them, you're careful, you give them antibiotics. It is possible, if everything hasn't died yet, to come back from this level of hypothermia and come back mentally intact. Often, without arms and legs, but mentally intact.
All right.
This is also the kind of hypothermia that doctors induce during certain open heart operations, so that they can repair the damage to the heart without having as much risk of heart and brain damage. If you bring everything down to a low enough level so they're not dead, you can operate on their heart for a little bit and then slowly bring them back. Grey's Anatomy wasn't totally lying.
Grey's Anatomy.
In 1888, though, once you reach this stage, you're pretty much done.
Yeah.
At around 87 degrees body temperature, hallucinations and delusions start. Many victims who have frozen and been brought back describe these as kind of being out-of-body experiences and often quite pleasant. They stop hurting. They can see what's going on. They might hallucinate being warm or food. One really good, literary example of this is the story of the little match girl, where she'd light a match and she would see a giant Christmas table. She'd light a match and she'd see a nice warm house. She'd light a match and see something else. But the next morning she was found dead by a passerby. Have you not heard that story?
No.
Okay, well, now I got to get that story. I'll put it in the show notes. It's a very famous story. It's a good one. Sometimes, though, these, especially at the end, right as you're about to die, these hallucinations can start feeling like actual warmth or fiery warmth, painful warmth. Right before the end, people can end up feeling like their skin is on fire. Doctors aren't entirely sure why this happens. It may be a delusion of an oxygen-deprived brain, or it may be in the last final seconds of consciousness, the body sends a surge of blood back into these constricted and broken blood vessels. Whatever the cause, though, victims of hypothermia can suddenly feel so hot and stifled that they suddenly rip all their clothes off before dying. This is so common in hypothermia cases that it has its own name: paradoxical undressing.
I've heard about this one.
This is a real thing.
Because this was some of the people involved in that thing on Everest.
Yep. They start, especially at the collar, ripping open your at your chest, ripping the bottom of the legs off. This is a thing that happens with hypothermia. And many of the victims of the children's blizzard were found with their clothing ripped off or torn to shreds. Before this phenomena was identified, police often mistook hypothermic women as victims of sexual assault. In one particularly interesting case, in January of 1719 in Sweden, there was hundreds of Swedish soldiers who were found after a 3-day battle stripped and dead in the field. It was assumed initially that they had been plundered by the enemy army, but doctors today now believe that they froze to death and tore their clothes off in a mass outbreak of paradoxical undressing.
Wow.
And this has been a thing that has happened for years. Now, at this time, the prevailing medical knowledge knew that shoving someone with frostbite near a warm fire and warming them up too quickly wasn't a great idea. So the general go-to method was instead to rub snow on the frozen parts of the body to try and warm them up slowly as the snow melted. This is not great. It's better than shoving them in front of a fire.
Right, but it's still
But it's
cold.
not great. The combination of so much frostbite and the prevailing medical information led to quite a number of amputations and quite a few people who ended up dying from infection after they had ridden the storm out itself.
Because you're rubbing the skin and it's breaking the skin.
It is. And this method did
Rubbing it off.
delay a lot of the pain associated with thawing out from frostbite. But when it came back, that pain,
Oh, sure.
it was significantly
So-
worse. On top of that, many of the doctors at the time didn't have experience with using ether or chloroform, the two forms of anesthetic, on children. So there were multiple cases of children undergoing amputations for frostbitten whatever without anything more than morphine in their system.
Oh, no. And why do the kids always get the shaft?
I mean,
And
this story, it's a tale as old as time, isn't it? The blizzard had mostly blown itself out over much of the prairie by the morning of the 13th, but the damage had been done. Over 1,000 miles of prairie were frozen solid. That morning, as rescue crews went around finding arms, legs, bodies sticking out of the snow, for many who could be rescued, some who made it through the night the next day just meant a slightly later death.
wow.
After being so cold, getting up and moving sent their bodies into shock, and they dropped dead feet away from where they had taken their rudimentary shelter. This is also a very common phenomena when people get hypothermia. This is called generally death by rescue, and it's very, very well documented. A cold heart is a very fragile heart.
Uh-huh.
Moving too quickly without being warmed up can cause it to just stop. In one particular case, this is why we take so long to warm people up and why modern doctors are so careful with it.
Uh-huh.
In 1979, so not modern medicine, but far
Yes.
more recent, 16 Danish fishermen were rescued from the waters of Greenland when their ship sank. And they ended up spending just over an hour in the waters of Greenland
No.
before they were being rescued.
How did they make it an hour in
They
that
made
water?
it an hour. They were all able, when the rescue ship arrived, they were all able to climb aboard the rescue ship under their own power. Once they got there, they were wrapped in blankets and given warm drinks, but when they stood to walk across the deck of the ship to go under, all 16 of them dropped dead. Can you
Oh my
imagine?
God.
And that's just one
That'd freak me the
example.
fuck out.
Death by rescue is a not uncommon thing that happens when people freeze like this. It's a whole thing. Now, it's estimated that somewhere around 20,000 people were outside and overtaken by the storm when all was said and done.
20,000?
Around 20,000.
Fuck.
It was known, or it's known as the schoolchildren's or children's blizzard, because so many of the victims were children who had been caught on their way home or when their teachers released them from school and the weather got awful. There was somewhere between 250 to 500 recorded deaths. There's likely more, but the totals were played down a lot because many of these bigger companies and the government still wanted people coming out to the prairie. Losing population would end up with people losing money, so they kind of just... I don't want to say they ignored it because the press definitely reported on it quite a bit, but like there was a big push to try and make sure we didn't make this sound too scary. That like, oh yeah, this is a bummer, but look at how great these people are. The newspapers really did go quite wild with it, and the way they kind of balanced that is they told really awful stories at first, and then they kind of switched over to telling stories of heroines in particular. So usually teenage school teachers who had saved their children. This is where Minnie, the story you recognized, got so famous because she was one of these heroines that the newspapers wrote about. And there's a number of others that they did as well. And they ended up raising a bunch of money for these women to help support them. Etta ended up, even though she died, the newspapers raised shit tons of money for her. And she ended up having like the most lavish funeral probably anyone had ever had up until that point on the prairie based on the money she got from it. The cold front that day was so strong that it made it all the way down into Mexico. It didn't stop until it got to the Gulf of Teotepec, which is like further south than the Gulf of Mexico. It's very, very far south. It was huge, enormous, and it was horrific on so many levels, but obviously the Midwest got hit the worst.
Yeah.
However,
That's wild.
pretty much no one blamed the Weather Service for not putting out warnings except for the southern plantations that lost crops.
Oh.
The people who actually died kind of looked at it as like, well, I guess not the people who died, the people whose family died,
Yeah.
looked at it as an act of God and didn't really blame the government whatsoever.
I mean, that also moved through like really fast.
It did move through like an act of God, that's for damn sure.
And it's the scenes you described of that just rolling across
Mhm.
seems very much like your apocalyptic movie event, like you're watching.
I finished reading about it, and before I wrote up the notes, I had to watch The Day After Tomorrow because
Yeah.
it feels very much like The Day After Tomorrow for sure.
That's wow.
So, yeah, no one really blamed the Weather Service. The Weather Service, though, did end up changing to the Department of Agriculture in 1890,
Okay.
not because of this disaster, but mainly because the agricultural conglomerates were the ones who were most pissed and wanted the Weather Service to work well. So that's
Yeah.
kind of, this is the beginning. We're eventually going to talk about the Galveston hurricane, which happened in 1900. And
Ooh.
just kind of keep this beginnings in your mind because it does
Okay.
play into a lot of what happened. We're going to go into way more detail on that when we do the Galveston hurricane.
You got it.
Now, the mood of the prairie really began to shift quite dramatically after the children's blizzard, despite the fact that newspapers and government were trying to keep up the optimism of that great migration to the prairie. That optimism kind of died that day. Folks were still moving, to be sure, but a lot more were starting to leave too. And when people started to talk about it, it wasn't nearly as, this is the best place ever, such a wonderful place to live. It was far more realistic about the dangers and the hazards of living in that area.
Yeah.
It was such a watershed event that it's still remembered on the plains to this day, made all the more poignant by the trials that the plains have suffered even after the blizzard. This was just kind of the start. Horrific things from the Dust Bowl to
Oh my God. Right.
there was a drought in the 1890s that was so fierce that thousands who ended up surviving the blizzard ended up dying because they starved. In 1893, there was a depression that hit and financial ruin that hit the United States. And a lot of farmers lost their farms at that point. On top of that, corn prices started to fall pretty dramatically. So even the ones who were able to farm were able to make a lot of money of it. By the time the drought of the 1890s had ended, over 60% of the pioneer families who had originally moved there had left. So within 15, 20 years of it really becoming this big migration, they're gone. And the migration has continued through the modern day.
Yeah.
In many ways, that migration has gotten worse. Right now, today, 2025, the Native American and bison populations on the plains more closely resemble what it looked like before that Great Migration than it did after. So many people have left the Great Plains, and I think a lot of people who live there would argue with this, and there are certainly big cities, but there are vast swaths of the plain where the bisons are coming back, where Native Americans are living very similarly to what they did before.
I mean, that's good for the bison.
It's good for the bison. It's fascinating. And it's a lot of people kind of look at it as settling the Great Plains was a great failed experiment and that it was never meant to be farmland. And it's kind of returning to what it was intended to be now. And I don't know if I mean, obviously, I don't think they should have kicked out the Native Americans. That's not great. I don't think we should be planning on kicking anyone out of the Great Plains anytime soon. But it is interesting because it's the weather there is hard. It's a hard place to live. Less so now with modern weather services and with, just everything that comes with living in modern society. But it's still hard. Every year, you see towns get nearly wiped off the map by tornadoes. Every year, you hear about how hard the weather is. It's a hard spot. And props to anyone who lives there, regardless of whether you're white, Native American, or whatever, because you're tough as shit to live on the Great Plains. But it is pretty fascinating that migration has continued away from the plains over those years. And that's just fact. We can look at the numbers. The number of people that live there is lower than it was in the 1870s.
That's wild.
It's bananas. So that's my blizzard story.
Whew.
You feeling okay?
It was chilling.
It's a tough one. And I struggled on what stories to highlight. I wanted to highlight some survivals and I wanted to highlight some not survivals. But it was hard to pick. I got to tell you, there is
a lot.
So many stories. And it's fascinating because it's definitely one of those things where anyone who had ancestors on the plains at that time has a story.
Huh.
And those stories are still remembered. You can go on the internet right now and look it up and find 50 blogs with people talking about what their great-grandma did in 1888 during the children's blizzard. It is still very, very remembered and very much a part of the cultural history of the Great Plains. And that is fascinating to me. And I'm so sorry. I feel so bad for everything that happened. But it's a watershed moment that people who are not from the area are not super duper aware of. So if you are from the area and I fucked it up, let me know.
Yeah.
I tried not to. You're awesome. But I know it means a lot to the people who live there. And I know it still lives in their head rent free. And that's, ancestral knowledge is a thing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And this is where we get that kind of ancestral knowledge, is by lots of death. I really thought
makes it stick in the memory
all day today about telling the kids every time they complained about how cold it was, how little they know.
It was chilly. It was not that cold.
No, it was I think it was 22 today. Nowhere near 40 below zero.
Yeah, no. I've experienced once, I think, -9.
I have not. I have no desire.
And that was awful.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
-40 without a hat,
without
a coat.
I know there's people in parts of the world who are going to laugh at me for that.
I don't care. They can laugh at me all they want.
Yeah.
I'm cold as shit if
sauce.
it gets below 60.
Yeah, right.
I want to go outside if it's 55 degrees. It's too cold for me. I know for sure I'm not going to survive that weather. And you can make fun of me all you want because I deserve it. I'm weak sauce. That's why I'm going to Florida. But I did consider telling the kids, you think this is bad? The children of 1888 had to walk home in a blizzard at -40 and then they died. What stopped me was Malcolm's face this morning when I accidentally made a joke and I was like, oh, that's too far. Never mind. So yeah, that is the story of the 1888 children's blizzard.
I will say, I almost cried.
Good.
One of those, the dad and the dog.
The dog.
And I thought it was going to be worse, but the older brother and
Walter and his brother Will.
Finding, yeah.
I liked that one in particular, and I made sure to include that one because Walter just
I thought they had no hope.
Well, because they didn't. They really should not have survived that. It's a miracle. Anyone who did survive it, and so many people did, it is truly quite miraculous that they made it. Because this is a lot. And to do it, what gets me every single time is that the vast majority of them were just in effectively the 1888 version of a t-shirt and shorts.
Yeah, it's wild.
And they survived that. Hours in that it's mind-boggling. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And made all the more poignant by those who didn't survive. So yeah, that is where we're at. Right now, we're in Florida. We're warm. I hope you're warm wherever you are. If you're not, turn on the heater because hopefully you're able to.
Right.
You're in a spot that you can just pop it up to 75 tonight because I think we all deserve 75 degrees in the house.
A little warmth.
No, it's not. It's good. So we have socials. Come find us. We're on TikTok. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on Threads. We're on Blue Sky. We're everywhere. Our website is www.catastrophe-chronicles.com. Our email is catastrophechroniclespod@gmail.com. We have a tip jar if you'd like to help financially support the pod. Don't feel obligated. We love you no matter what. And with that,
stay safe, everyone.
And stay curious.